Okay, so here's the plan. Before we do that, though, I think it's shayach, it's kedai, it's relevant to step back a second and go back to maybe the philosophical underpinnings of what we're talking about. In other words, the feminists who have certain issues with Judaism and who raise certain issues, it's important to understand where they're coming from, right? And at the same time, it's important to remind ourselves every once in a while where we're coming from. In other words, what are the philosophical underpinnings of Judaism as it relates to women's issues? In other words, what is the Torah's attitude towards women and womanhood and the woman's role? So we've talked a lot about this, but I don't think we ever really, for a long time, at the very beginning of this series, we we went back to the beginning and looked at what does the Torah say about womanhood, the female being, and female nature. And I think that what we need to do is step back and go really back to the beginning before we can further discussion of, well, can a woman be a rabbi? Because the question of whether a woman can be a rabbi really goes to the question of what does the Torah say about the nature of a woman? Right, and what does the Torah say about the legality of such a pursuit? Right. So we're gonna step back. I'm dealing with. I'm using as my source material. The majority of it is a book by Michael Kaufman called Feminism and Judaism. I didn't bring it here. It's a really nice book. Kaufman, Kaufman. In addition, I'm using a book called by Rabbi Moshe Meiselman called The Jewish Woman in Jewish Law, and I'm also indebted to Rebbetzin Heller. She has great lectures online if you want to look her up.
What is the book?
The second book?
Yeah.
Or Michael Kaufman?
No, second.
The second book is The Jewish Woman in Jewish Law. Okay. All right, and the third thing I mentioned was Rebbetzin Heller. So today, and the next few classes, I'd like to actually go through this book, Feminism and Judaism. I think it really gives a very important, broad view, historical view of both feminism, as we know it today, modern secular feminism. And the reason that's important is because, again, the Jewish feminists take a lot of their arguments and a lot of their philosophical foundations from secular feminism in all its varied forms, and there are several forms of it. So I think, and this book that I'm using by Kaufman really goes through from a historical perspective and looks at what's it all about, what's the feminist movement all about, where did it come from, how did it arise, why did it arise, and then discusses the Jewish view of it, or their view of it's really very, very interesting book. So I'm not going to go into very detailed discussion, but I think it pays to just touch on the topics that he raises. So today's my broad plan for this book is that today's class is going to be discussing the sort of historical philosophical thought that about woman and womanhood that really has influenced Western society's view of woman, as well as how women were treated throughout history, throughout the modern day history in Western culture. Okay, and that will also give us the sort of departure point and contrast points to how Judaism views womanhood, right? So today's class is going to look at just really a very, very quick, broad historical view of where did this idea of womanhood in Western thought come from. All right, so again, I ask if you have any questions to hold them to the end rather than in between, and I'll leave time at the end for questions. Okay, so this is I'm sorry this is not touching specifically on the issue of the Torah, but we will, and everything I say today, by the way, will be countered in next week's class with the Torah review. We're going to go back to the original story of how Hashem created woman and how Hashem created woman and man, and those are two separate things. You may remember the story of the creation of the first human being, and it will also touch on the situation in the Garden of Eden, in Gan Eden, and the sin that Adam and Chava, the sin that they did. And this story is going to provide us with really the majority of the foundation, the philosophical foundation of how the Torah views woman, and how the Torah, what the Torah, what is the Torah's opinion and view of the female and female spirituality, as well as our roles in the world as well. Okay, so all right, that was a 5-minute introduction. So sorry about that. Okay, so again, I want to go back. So we're going to look at, and I'm going to go, I hope, a little bit quickly, because I don't want to get too bogged down in historical details, but just to give us an overview. Where did the idea, the modern idea of womanhood, where did it begin? So really we have to go back to the beginning of Western civilization and Greece, ancient Greece, right? So the woman in Greek thought was very, very negative. First of all, they were second-class citizens. It was very common to kill female babies, and there was this practice called exposing infants, which means you left them on a mountain to die, basically. And it was very common, and it was also sanctioned by law. A very common practice. So women were from the very get-go considered lesser human beings. In addition, a child was under the control and power and rule of the males in her family. Her father and her brothers could do as they pleased with her. For example, they could kill the sister. They could do an honor killing if they thought that a girl was being wanton. If she was not doing what was thought proper, there would be an honor killing. It was totally okay. She could be married off at an early age by her father. A widow, and if she was widowed, she actually reverted to the control of her father or his relatives. In other words, she was never an legally independent person. Interestingly, the relationships between husbands and wives in ancient Greece was very vastly different from what we would, the idea that we have. Plutarch said love could not exist between a husband and wife because you need to have, what do you need for love? For love, you need mutual respect. And there couldn't be mutual respect. Why? Aristotle said the relationship between a husband and wife is like the relationship between government and the governed. Okay, so once you have this unequal idea, Aristotle said that. So he said the affection between husband and wife is the same as that which exists between the government and governed. So therefore, of course, you can't have an equal amount of respect for each party if you don't have, if the government and the governed do not have an equal relationship. They're not on an equal status, so therefore they can't be mutual respect. In practice, husband and wife didn't really associate very much together. They ate separately. They had different social lives. The wife didn't really get involved in the husband's social life, and they rarely talked. Apparently, it was basically a mutual, sort of business deal, which presumed that the purpose of marriage was for procreation. Husbands could list wives in their wills as property to be passed along to whomever they wished. In fact, while they were married, she could also be traded or given to a friend. She was considered property, pure property. Okay, a divorced woman they basically relinquished her any control over her kids. The kids went to the husband immediately, and of course they couldn't own property. They weren't citizens. All right, so that was ancient Greece. Now this may have something to do with the origin story of the woman in Greek myth. So the story of how woman was created or why she was created is that Prometheus, you may know the story of Prometheus. He was a human, and he stole fire from the gods to give to man. Okay, that was the story of Prometheus. He was punished, but one of the ways he was punished, according to Greek myth, was that Zeus created woman as his punishment. Okay, so she was a tool. She was something that would plague him, and actually that Zeus calls women a plague. So in the foundation story of the ancient Greeks, you have one half of humanity having an identity of this negative, destructive force. So it's really no surprise then that women would be devalued in this society. Okay, Aristotle has some interesting quotes about women. He says that the only value women had was to perpetuate the species. Okay, that's fine. But even in that role, they were passive. He says they provided the seed, the matter, I guess the passive receptacle, while the male seed provided the life force. So even in the role of procreation, women's role is a negative. They're negative space in the words of the feminists. They're negative space. Women, he also said, were a monstrosity and a deformity. He said the male is more divine and better than the female, and he even called for legislation to be able to kill female babies. In other words, he wanted to make it, really legal and subjugate them. This was Aristotle, the famous philosopher that we're all told was the one of the greatest philosophers of the world. So yeah. Okay. Now in Roman times, we're moving on now in history. In Roman times, the status of woman was a little bit better. She had a little more respect accorded to her. Her status was higher. She had a little more dignity, but legally she was in the same boat. She was dependent on the male in her family, her husband or her father. A man legally could beat his wife or kill his wife and face absolutely no consequences. He could hunt her for sport and there would be absolutely no problem with it. Philosophically, at this time, it was also thought that women were failed males, that women lacked heat, there was something wrong with them, they were soft. As the Roman Empire wore on, their status seemed to improve, but they still had, they were not citizens, they couldn't vote, etc. They couldn't run for office. All right, so they were still pretty bad off. Now we come to Christianity. All right, let's discuss Christianity. Again, going through history, progressing here. So the theology and ideology of Christianity really has been by far the most influential in terms of Western thought, right? Western thought really, in a lot of ways, philosophically finds its foundation in Christianity. So we have to look a little more closely at what the philosophical underpinnings of this religion were when it comes to women. Okay, and this is, we go back to really the way that Christianity was formed. In a way, their view of women was actually a little bit worse than, you could say is a little bit worse than in ancient Greek or Roman times, because they sort of had the sanction of divinity behind them. So anything that the church fathers were saying came with the stamp of, God. Basically, this is the way God wants it. So yeah. Say again? What?
Okay, so they had the stamp of God, and what significance did they have on women?
We're going to see in a minute.
Oh,
I'm going to discuss that.
Okay.
In the process of divorcing itself from Judaism, the new church wanted to establish a new church, right? As a result, they did away with a lot of the teachings of Judaism. For example, a lot of Greco-Roman ideas entered into the church canon. In fact, the church canon law was partially based on Greco-Roman law. Okay, so Paul and other fathers of the church, like Augustine and Aquinas, they based a lot of their ideas about women also on Greco-Roman ideas, on Aristotle, for example, rather than the Torah's teaching. And this is due to the fact that Paul, when he was establishing the new religion, he really wanted to break with Judaism. Okay, apparently, from what we understand, Jesus and his disciples were Torah observant. That's what it says, that they observed the laws, and he didn't want a break with the laws, right? But Paul, when he was establishing the new religion, wanted more of a break. In fact, he made it so that pagans who were converted to Christianity did not have to be observant. All right, so that was a major break that he did. In addition, okay, so now we have to go back to the origin story of woman. Let's look at it, and how did Paul interpret it? That really was the foundation of how they looked at women. So his reinterpretation of the story of creation of man and woman is really where it all begins. The first in Bereshit, now I'm quoting, this is the verse of the text in Genesis. It says, God created man in his image. In the image of God did he create him. Male and female, he created them. Okay, now, so he first created man, God created man in his image, right? In the image of God did he create him. Male and female, he created them. Now, that's the plain shot, what we call the plain text. Now, the Jewish, scholars over the centuries and midrash and the discussions of this pasuk find a very odd contradiction in this one verse, in that it uses both the singular and plural pronouns to describe this first creature, right? It says him in the same verse, him and them, male and female, he created them. Our scholars and our midrashim, our interpreters look at this verse and glean a lot, understand a lot about women and men and male and female, and specifically the equality of male and female, and we're going to discuss this in the next class, from this verse, from the fact that there's a contradiction, the fact that the verse uses both him and them. We also know that this indicates, this is where the midrashim find evidence for the idea that male and female were created together, and originally man and woman was one unit, one body, one person, right? Again, we're going to get into that later. So for us, the contradiction indicates material to be understood on a deeper level, right? Paul simply sees that it says that God created man in his image, and God created man in his image. In the image of God did he create him, and says, this means that only man was created in God's image. Okay, he says, the head of the woman is the man, for a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. The woman has no part in the divinity, in divine being. There's no divine spark in her. There's no divine, image in woman. And he goes on to say, the woman is created for the man. Okay, this idea that that only the man was created in God's image, the woman was not, therefore she is a lesser divine being. That is a major theme throughout the early Christian teachings. All right, and of course, this also perpetuates the idea of man's superiority to woman, clearly, and woman's natural, God-given subservience and lesser being than man. Okay, now this interpretation, again, was the philosophical, foundation of the philosophy of woman as a lesser being, a sub-creation. And she's also someone who threatens male spiritual development, as we're going to see, because Paul goes on to read the story of the sin, right? Now, according to go ahead.
Well, Paul was Jewish, apparently.
I suppose, yeah.
So it's interesting that he had the temerity to reinterpret the Torah like this. I mean, I'm assuming he knew that that's not how.
I'm not sure. I from what I've read, it sounds like he was making deliberate steps away from the Torah, meaning that he did know, maybe. But I'm not an expert in.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody is. It's such a cloudy area.
Right.
So I don't know. I was just thinking about his motivation. Was he changing it to the more Greco-Roman ideas because he wanted to sell it to that world?
Possibly.
Or
right.
does he really believe that?
Right.
Or
my guess would be a combination of both, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
My guess would be that being that he really was consciously trying to establish a new religion, that he wanted to make it as palatable and as attractive as possible for the pagans around him, right? So therefore, maybe to incorporate ideas from what they were already used to and knew
but he probably had his
was the goal.
own personal issues. Because didn't he say it's better to marry than to
Oh, I'm going to get up to that in a second. Let's just go first to the sin. So the story of the sin, right? In Judaism, as we're going to see next week and the week after, Judaism puts the blame for the sin on both parties. Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, were both culpable in the sin. Christianity does not view it that way at all. Paul did not view it that way at all. In the view of Christianity, all of the blame goes on Chava's shoulders, all of it. It was, why? Because she's naturally a weaker creature. So she was more prone to sin from the get-go. From the get-go.
So he hated his mother.
Who, Paul?
Yeah. That's my
I'm not quite sure. Well, it's interesting you say that, because as we're going to see, the views of womanhood in Christianity are so negative that it is hard to understand how they could have any respect for any female. We'll go on and see that. So, excuse me, it was Chava, Eve's weakness, that led her to disobey God's prohibition and give Adam the fruit, thereby condemning, so she's the cause of condemning them to mortality and exile. Quote, it was not, this is Paul, quote, it was not Adam who was deceived and became a transgressor. It was the woman who broke God's law. So it's clear, it's her fault. That carries through all the way. We're going to see what the other church fathers have to say about this. Now, it's important to understand also that Eve's sin was her tempting of Adam was a metaphor for a sexual temptation, right? So so Christianity views her sin as a sexual sin. In other words, her temptation of Adam with the apple is a symbol of her sexuality, right? So therefore, the temptation is an erotic temptation. Christianity thus associated original sin with sexuality. So there was, right away from the get-go, from the original story of this in the Garden of Eden, the great flaw of humanity, the original sin, was associated with sexual relations. Okay, so what followed from this, of course, if in your philosophy, sex is something evil and sinful, automatically, the family and womanhood is also denigrated, right? In fact, what followed also from this was the idea of human holiness. In other words, the soul is separate from sexuality, from the body. Now we Jews, Judaism and the Torah does not have that attitude at all, right? But they had this idea that in order to be holy, you have to abstain. You have to abstain from the physical. Now we know that the soul is not considered. We don't consider the soul, the body rather, to be this dirty, base, earthy sort of negative space that we just happen to inhabit. We consider the body the house of the soul, right? And they work hand in hand. In fact, you cannot do any of the mitzvos in the Torah without the body, right? All of the mitzvos that we do are connected to using our body. Our legs run to shul, our digestive systems eat kosher food and make brachos, and we speak and we pray, and all of it. You can't do any of the mitzvos without the soul, and then we really do have that more elevated idea of the body than the Christians do. All right, but as a result of their philosophy, that idea that the body and sexuality is something to be really be pushed away, celibacy became the ideal in the Christian religion. We do not have that ideal. It's not at all something that we say a person should strive for. So if celibacy is the ideal, right, marriage and woman, who is representative of sexuality herself, is denigrated. She's thought of as a necessary evil. Here's what you were referring to. Paul says, it's better not to marry. But, he says, if you cannot restrain your desires, it is better to marry than to burn with passion, meaning to burn in hell, okay? So if you're going to burn in hell because you have this base lust, fine, then marry. But marriage is still seen as a necessary evil, as sort of the lesser of the two evils, okay? So woman was seen as a necessary evil. All right, so they're weak, the weaker vessel, they're easily tempted, and they're also a temptress responsible for the fall of man, and they are basically, something you have to use in case you can't be celibate, which is the highest ideal. Okay. Now the church fathers later continued this misogyny, excuse me, Tertullian said, "Women are the devil's gateway, the first deserter of the divine law. How easily you destroyed man, the image of God." Again, all on woman. This is all her fault. And because of this, he said, a woman should go around in rags and mourning and try to hide her beauty. You shouldn't be proud of it. You should hide it and try to expiate her, her.
Who said that?
This was Tertullian, with one of the church fathers, early Tertullin, Tertullian. She should try to repent for that first crime and shame of having brought ruin to humanity, he says. Diodorus says that by virtue of man being created in the image of God, God gave man the power to rule over the earth, right? Women were one of these creatures that man was supposed to rule over. Now, in reality, the verse says, "And God blessed them and said to them, rule over earth and have dominion over every creature," but they forget about that little thing. All right. The church father John Chrysostom said, "Women ruined all. The whole sex is weak and fickle. The whole female race transgressed. It's only the woman's job is just to obey her husband. They need greater care, women do, because of their ready inclination to sin." Augustine, actually, he was a little bit nicer. He said, Paul had said man was man was born in the image, created in the image of God. Augustine said, together a husband and wife can be the image of God, but alone, if they're not married, a man is still the image of God. Woman can never be. So it's only by joining in with this partner who himself represents the divine image that a woman can aspire to be so as well.
Who's kind of
This was Augustine. He says he explains the fact that actually Christian teaching apparently says a husband should love his wife. He explains this. He says a husband needs to love his wife the way the way that a Christian is taught to love their enemies. Okay. He says a good Christian loves the fact that she is human and hates the fact that she's a woman. All right. So you need to somehow get around this natural evil that she has in her and try to love her anyway. All right? With an attitude like that, you really do wonder at the level of respect that they had for any woman. Jerome said further, a woman could become a man if she serves God the right way. Then her highest praise would be that we would call her a man. All right, so she earns no merit in and of herself. But the level of manhood that's the paradigm of virtue. And if you want to be good, you've got to aspire to being that. All right. Now, the early church philosophy, again, had this dichotomy of souls and bodies, right? The early church fathers were ascetic. They were monastic. They identified women with spirituality. And, of course, sexuality, which is equated with filth and sin. So, therefore, there was a horror of sex. Virgin Mary, of course, was held up as a paragon of virtue because she was a virgin. She was asexual. So men were associated with divinity, with spirituality, with intellect. Women were associated with, your base nature, with earthiness, with the body, with flesh, with sensuality. As a result of their sin, women were urged to just submit to their husbands. Paul, in fact, said women are commanded to be in utter obedience. He forbade them from teaching. He forbade them from speaking up in church. He said women should be quiet, should learn in silence. They must keep quiet. If they want to find out something about what's going on in church, they should ask their husbands at home. Okay. Moving on. In the Middle Ages, nothing was really much better, but the thing that they tried to do, the clergy tried to start bringing science into the equation. They started to say, well, what's the scientific basis for the inferiority of women? Right? So, according to Albertus Magnus, I guess, one of the later church fathers, he said, women are more prone to sin because of their high liquid content. So apparently women have a higher liquid content than men. And what is the nature of liquid? It moves, it's fluid, it moves around, it's not constant. So women are not faithful, okay? So therefore, women are constant and curious, and this is a negative, of course.
What was his last name?
This was Albertus Magnus. And he goes on to explain that she's more liquid because she was created by the south wind, which carries moisture from the Mediterranean, and men were created by the drier north wind. I don't even try to understand that. Thomas Aquinas got into the discussion and said women were basically defective men, all right, born from accidents in the male sperm. All right, so they're an accident of nature. All right, so why was woman created? He said for the sole purpose of procreation. Right? And again, as we mentioned before, he said their job is really to supply the formless matter, basically their receptacles. Excuse me. And in addition, their weakness and their lesser intellect made them unfit to educate their children. And again, right, they just had, they had to give in to the man's higher virtue, stronger reason, etc. Okay. The Protestant Reformation came along. Okay, now Martin Luther had some very different ideas about marriage. He actually saw that marriage was beneficial. He said that marriage is to the benefit not alone of the body, honor, and soul of an individual, but to the benefit of whole cities and countries. So the idea of marriage was a little bit more positive. However, the view of woman was that woman was inferior still persisted. All right. In addition, the idea of intercourse, of marital relations, was shameful. He went further. He says like this: union is so hideous, union meaning physical union, is so hideous and frightful a pleasure that physicians compare it with epilepsy or falling sickness. Oh. So not only now do you have this idea of sexuality as sinful, it is also now a physical ailment. There's some disease associated with it. So the activity of procreation is linked to a disease. He says we cannot make use of woman without the horrible passion of lust, and so to speak, without epilepsy. Okay. Calvin, jumping ahead, said also that men cannot attain perfection without celibacy. So again, you have this view of woman as a necessary evil. It's just something that I wish I could do without, but in order to stop me from sinning, I'm going to get married. The witch hunts that were practiced in Europe that started in around 1300s and continued for a few centuries were sort of this natural, viewed in the light of all that I've said about Christian philosophy, is sort of a natural, you wonder why it didn't start earlier, right? Why didn't they just hunt them down altogether? Sort of natural outgrowth of this misogyny, right? The idea was that women was weaker, so therefore she is more prone to being influenced by the devil, who was a very real persona, right, to the early Christians. Therefore, she's prone to the devil's seductions, and all witchcraft, in addition, derives from carnal lust. Well, that's basically the same as saying derives from womanhood. Right? Therefore, she's easy prey for the devil. So because women are causing men to sin, it was totally acceptable to hunt them down, root out this evil, and burn them, right? Of course, in addition, anyone who doubted the legitimacy of such a hunt was also labeled a witch, right? So it's just a natural development from considering women, evil and the devil, to them considering them basically partners with the devil, right? So yeah.
I'm thinking it does sound like Christianity took things a step further than the Greco-Roman world, because am I wrong? Like if the Greco-Roman world saw women as inferior, they thought it was okay to have homosexual relationships. I don't know if I'm right about that.
That was connected, the idea was connected, certainly more in ancient Greece than in Rome. In Greece, it was the male-male relationship was considered the pinnacle of true love. There was no sense of the idea of love as it related to man and woman. The ideal love relationship was male-male.
It sounds like Christianity added this new dimension where they're projecting their own self-loathing and self-hatred and misunderstanding of male sexuality onto the woman.
Right.
So it's like they see the woman as the devil, but what they're also saying is the very fact that men have these desires is sort of sick and repulsive. That That's really a new step forward in
Yeah.
yuckiness, isn't
Yeah.
it?
In what?
In yuckiness. I mean,
Definitely yucky.
did the Greco-Romans think that male sexuality and desires were so repugnant?
That's a good
and,
question.
we have to, be celibate and.
I don't think they had that idea at all.
Yeah, so this is
Because she's asking about whether the Greco-Roman culture also had this despising of human lusts. I don't think that. I don't think so.
Yeah, it's just very interesting that all of a sudden it's coming out now, this despising of male sexuality.
Right. Sexuality in general, yeah. I mean, yeah, right, exactly. Again, I don't know what the,
weird.
yeah.
I mean, how much weirder can you get?
Right.
I mean, it's one thing to hate women, but it's another thing to hate your own sexuality, especially if you're made in the image of God.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
it seems at least the Greco-Romans had an outlet. I can have, platonic love or love another man, and that's okay and beautiful, and male bodies are gorgeous and all of that. But
Right.
this is so twisted.
I think I think it just sort of extended naturally from the idea of the dichotomy between the body and the soul. Once you make that dichotomy really clear, once you say the body is all physical and the soul is all spiritual because I can't see it and it's divine, it comes from God, if I understand that, excuse me, then it's an easier step to say anything that comes from God is good, but anything that involves, bodily functions in general, whether that be eating and drinking, enjoying yourself in any, physical pursuit or pleasure, is bad or has evil associations. It's possible also that development, that philosophical development, was actually in reaction to Greco-Roman, because you have the Hellenistic idea was very much Epicurean, the enjoyment, the indulgence in the physical. And it's possible that the Christian philosophy developed away from that they wanted to separate, philosophically at least, from that idea that pleasures of the flesh is a good pursuit. And so you have the dichotomous, the opposite. Yeah, you're right, exactly. Yeah, they took it to the extreme, but the idea was, was maybe rooted partly in that, and the desire to move away from that pleasures of the flesh as a good thing. So you made that dichotomy, and then you just took it to its nth degree, to its most extreme.
We humans are so weird.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, one more small little section here, and then we'll open it up to other questions. So women and the law in Europe during this time. What was their standing in the law? Well, again, it follows from this philosophical underpinnings of Christianity that women were not in a good position. They were, men had right to, for example, again, the rights of the woman were subsumed under the rights of the man in the family, the father, and then later the husband, let's say. Excuse me, couldn't own property. The man had a right to beat his wife, and corporal punishment was absolutely okay, even again in Europe in later times. And it was considered their duty to keep the wives on the straight and narrow, to punish her as you would punish a child, really. In England, the husband's right to beat the wife was not rescinded until 1891. The legal right to beat his wife was not rescinded until 1891. Of course, we know in Judaism, there's no such thing as hitting another human being, let alone your wife, right? There's not this idea that you're allowed to do that. Married woman, of course, gave up her possessions to her husband. This is similar in Judaism, but way different in terms of one thing, a woman has a choice in the Jewish marriage contract. She has a choice. There was no choice here in terms of secular law. There was, I don't know if you're aware of this. I wasn't aware of this until I read this book. it was quite common to sell your wife. Now we're talking about Europe up until, and we're talking about England in the 20th century. It was not officially legal, but it was common practice to sell your wife at auction. This was actually Thomas Hardy, in his novel, I think it's The Mayor of Casterbridge, has a scene in which he discusses this, such a sale. And the Times of London, the London Times, reported such sales even in the 20th century. So again, it wasn't common and it certainly was not legal, but there are lots of records that refer to the sale of a wife. Apparently, now this is more common the idea was that the poorer people would, in a way, as a way of, let's say, staying out of the poorhouse or the workhouse, had no other option, so they would sell a wife. And she would be led by a halter into the public square and put up for auction and bought. I know. Until 1939 in England.
Clothes on or off?
Say again? Clothes on. Okay. No, you weren't selling her for her body. You were selling her for what she could do for your. I mean, she was basically an unpaid slave in the house. She would cook and clean and and bear your children. Right? So it wasn't viewed, marriage even then wasn't viewed as something that was love-based. It was a practical arrangement. And then until 1939 in England, women had no legal rights over their children even after their husband's death. So way into the 20th century, women's rights, of course they didn't have voting rights until the suffragette movement as well in the 20th century. Way into the 20th century, you had women who were really at the whim and discretion of the males in their lives. Right. So that brings us to what the Torah has to say about women. And for this, we're going to start this next week. We're going to go back to look at the texts and see what is our basic foundational beliefs. What does our Masorah, our tradition, tell us about the stories that we read and what they have to say about the value of a woman, of womanhood, right, and her role in the world. So are there any questions on this, on today's, any further questions? Yeah, Sheila.
So the Jews were living a very different life than their neighbors.
They were.
And I was curious, do you think there'd be some sort of, unless they were so separated that they didn't even aware of
Yeah.
the rest of the world, or the rest of the people
Right.
near them who weren't
Right.
Jews, could see that such a difference.
Well, first of all, in ancient times, they really were located in Israel, right? With the Roman exile, it was really the first time. I mean, not the first time, but that was the Roman exile really started the diaspora as we know it today, right? The modern diaspora. The diaspora really spread the Jews around the world, but mostly in Europe, of course. Some in northern Africa, but you had communities here and there. But I would say that the majority, and I think historians would also agree, that the majority of Jews who were exiled were lost to us. They were just lost. We have the lost 10 tribes. We don't know where 10 of our 12 tribes are, right? They were lost in exile, which means they were assimilated, which means they did get subsumed under the dominant culture they were living under. The pockets of Jewish life that remained did keep themselves very separate from the secular cultures around them. Obviously we know the history of where those communities were and what they did, and of course they were kicked out of one country after another. Partially that's because they identified as Jews, and if they identified as Jews and practiced as Jews, they were living very different lives. They did live very different lives, yeah, as much as they were able. You know what I'm saying? There were some societies that outlawed certain Jewish practices, but for the most part, they were able, because secular society also, not secular society, but non-Jewish society, those societies were also religiously based, right? In other words, marriages were religiously based, as we discussed when we talked about the Jewish marriage contract. and the get. The problem in the modern day world was that once marriage was divorced from the religious ceremony, you suddenly had all of this shenanigans when it comes to giving your wife a get. We didn't have that before the modern age because marriage was not a civil institution. It was always a religious institution. So therefore you had, the Jews kept themselves and did their religious thing. And then the rest of the society did their religious thing. So we were able to keep our religious identity. And again, those communities that survived because we were separate. And those are the communities that were able to trace the lineage, of that community. You know what I'm saying? The ones that got lost because they didn't keep those laws and traditions. Fascinating history, the Jewish history is so
What were the
fascinating.
two tribes that didn't get lost?
Well, Levi, okay, we say that because we know today, we know who's a Kohen and who's a Levi, right? People, Kohanim, priests, know who they are. My husband's a Levi, a Kohen, meaning he's from the tribe of Levi. So that didn't get lost. And the other one is Benjamin. And everybody else, we don't know, yeah.
And those people that descended from Benjamin, we just say basically.
They're a Yisrael, what we call, we have 3 categories of Jews, Kohen, Levi, Yisrael would be the rest. And if we had all the other tribes of Israel with us, they would also be called Yisrael.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.